The morning began like any other. The sun slowly rose over the pig family's house, its rays passing through the green walls of the living room, leaving familiar shadows on the orange sofa. Daddy Pig had already turned on the TV, Mummy Pig was washing the dishes, and Peppa and George were just waking up. But something wasn't right. Peppa opened her eyes and immediately felt an unusual silence. The house seemed to have stopped breathing. The air was thick and heavy, like before a storm. There were no familiar sounds, no footsteps, no birds outside, only a distant humming, like a faint electric buzz. She sat up in bed. George was sleeping peacefully, but even his breathing sounded too steady, too artificial. Peppa stood up and walked to the door. The floor felt cold beneath her hooves, and every step echoed softly. The hallway looked familiar, but the light was strange, dull and cloudy, as if the walls were swallowing the sunlight. When she went downstairs, her heart froze. Her whole family was already sitting at the table. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George. Bowls of porridge sat in front of them, untouched. None of them moved. They sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Their eyes were wide open, gleaming with an unnatural light, and their smiles looked drawn on, too wide, too perfect. "Good morning," Peppa said quietly. No one replied. Daddy Pig slowly turned his head. The motion was sharp, jerky, like a puppet on a string. "Good morning, Peppa," he said in a flat, muffled tone. Peppa flinched. At that moment, the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showing static. The sound of white noise filled the room. Peppa stepped closer. The image began to clear. On the screen was her, but the reflection moved differently. It lagged behind slightly, then froze and suddenly waved. Peppa didn't move. The reflection smiled, first faintly, then wider and wider, until the mouth stretched too far, distorting the shape of her face. The TV hissed, and a distorted voice spoke backward. The words were garbled, but Peppa somehow felt it was speaking to her. She pressed the remote. Nothing happened. She changed the channels. All of them showed the same thing, her face, smiling, silent. She backed away toward the table. Mummy Pig and George were now looking at her. Their smiles didn't fade. Their eyes moved in perfect unison, following her every step. George's toy dinosaur sat on the table. Its plastic eyes blinked. Peppa screamed and ran upstairs. The staircase seemed to stretch under her feet, her steps echoing louder than usual. The house repeated every sound, as if breathing with her. Her bedroom was dark, even though the sun still shone outside. Peppa approached the mirror. In the reflection stood herself, but not quite. Her fur looked darker, her eyes hollow, and her mouth stretched in an unnatural grin. The reflection slowly placed its hooves against the glass from the inside. The surface fogged up, as if it were breathing. "Who are you?" Peppa whispered. No answer, only a faint crackling sound, like the TV's static, filled the room again. Peppa stepped closer. Her reflection copied the movement, slightly delayed, like a broken recording. And then, in perfect sync. Both Peppas pressed their hooves to the glass. For a moment, the house froze. Then a familiar voice echoed from below. "Peppa, breakfast's ready." She stumbled back. The room brightened. The laughter of her family floated up from downstairs, soft, cheerful. Everything looked normal again. Peppa took a deep breath, trying to convince herself it had all been a dream. She opened the door and went down. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George were sitting at the table, smiling and lively. "Good morning, Peppa," they said together. Peppa sat down but didn't answer. There was something wrong with their voices. Too smooth, too even, as if they were speaking in rhythm. She glanced at the window. The sunlight shone as always, but her reflection moved a second later. And when Peppa blinked, the reflection didn't. It only smiled. Morning in Peppa Pig's house began differently than usual. She opened her eyes and immediately felt something was wrong. The room looked familiar, but the air was heavy, pressing, filled with a suffocating silence. George lay beside her, hugging his dinosaur, but she couldn't even hear his breathing. Peppa carefully got up and went downstairs. Normally, at this time, Mummy Pig would be making breakfast, and the house would be filled with the smell of porridge. But now, a different smell greeted her. Cold, empty, like a room where no one had lived for a very long time. Her family was waiting in the living room. Mummy, Daddy, and George sat on the sofa. They didn't move, they didn't speak. Their eyes were completely empty, like two black ovals, without reflection, without life. On their faces was the same wide, identical smile. They turned their heads toward Peppa all at once, and there was nothing natural in that movement. Peppa took a step back, and at that moment the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showed static, and then her reflection. Only it wasn't hers. The face on the screen was distorted, the eyes too big, the mouth twisted, and most terrifying of all, it didn't move the way she did. When Peppa blinked, the reflection kept staring with wide, unblinking eyes. When she raised her hoof, her copy did the same, but with a delay and at a strange angle, like a puppet pulled on strings. Sound filled the room. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't music. It was a jumble of distorted phrases, spoken backwards. They overlapped, merging into a droning noise that made her ears ache. Peppa covered them with her hooves, but the sound continued inside her head. Her family stood up from the sofa and took a step forward. Their movements were synchronized, which made it even more terrifying. Peppa ran upstairs into her room and slammed the door shut. But the mirror in her bedroom was already waiting for her. Inside was the same copy from the screen. It was moving faster now, scratching at the glass with its hooves from the inside. Cracks spread across the surface, and its lips began to move. At first, silently. Then, through the crackling, she heard words, backwards and barely recognizable. "Let me in." The mirror splintered. In panic, Peppa pulled back, clutching the doorknob. And at that instant, everything fell silent again. The silence was thick, buzzing. She slowly went downstairs. The kitchen greeted her with a new, horrifying sight. Sitting right on the table was Laboo. Her favorite toy had always seemed harmless, but now it looked different. Its eyes were hollow, black, and its smile stretched too wide, as if the fabric of its face was ready to rip apart. In Laboo's paws was George's torn dinosaur. Threads hung from it, and the plastic body was twisted into an unnatural pose. Peppa froze, unable to move. Laboo slowly lifted its head. Its mouth didn't move, but a long hissing sound came from within. Then it stretched its tiny paw toward Peppa. Fear paralyzed her. She felt she couldn't scream, couldn't run. Laboo tilted its head slightly, as if saying, "You knew it would come to this." She felt the walls of the house begin to tremble. Lights flickered on in the corridor by themselves. Shadows stretched across the walls, too long, moving as if they were copying her every gesture. The television turned on again, and this time the distorted Peppa didn't just appear on the screen. It began to crawl halfway out. Its lips stretched into a grin, and it winked. Peppa covered her face with her hooves. She understood this day would not end. It would repeat again and again. And Laboo, sitting on the table, was there to make sure of it. His eyes glowed red, his smile stretched even wider. He was waiting. Spring in the pig family's house began with cleaning. Mummy Pig was washing the windows, Daddy Pig was vacuuming, and Peppa and George were dusting their toys. Everything was cheerful, until suddenly, from below, a strange sound echoed from the basement. It was a dull, scraping noise, like something heavy slowly rolling across the floor. "Daddy, did you hear that?" asked Peppa. Daddy Pig didn't respond, too busy tidying up. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a long rustling. Curiosity took over, and Peppa pulled George by the hand. "Let's go see." Maybe something just fell. They opened the basement door. A wave of damp, dusty air rushed out. The stairs creaked under each step, and the lower they went, the colder it became. In the farthest corner, among old boxes, lay a round object that looked like a tire. It was covered in dust, but beneath the grime, faint wet spots glistened, as if alive. "What's that?" asked George. Peppa stepped closer. Something flickered in the center of the tire. She gasped. It was an eye, large, still, and cloudy, like a frog's. It blinked. The tire shuddered, turned slightly, and Peppa saw that underneath it were human legs, thin and grey, while from the top, emerging out of the shadows, was a frog-like head with a wide mouth and damp, rubbery skin. The creature stood motionless, staring straight at them. George clutched Peppa's hand. "Peppa, what is that?" It didn't move. Only a faint rhythmic whisper came from deep within the basement, as if someone were chanting meaningless words. Laboo, Laboo." Peppa stepped back. "We have to go." But the staircase behind them was gone. In its place hung a thick grey mist. The air grew heavy, almost sticky. A thin vapor rose from the tire, spreading around them. The world began to tremble. The floor disappeared beneath their feet, and the walls melted away, turning into clouds of fog. When the trembling stopped, they were no longer at home. Peppa and George stood in an empty space with no ceiling or floor. Glowing shadows floated slowly in the air, as if the objects themselves had come to life. Toys, shelves, furniture, everything drifted weightlessly, like in a dream. And in the middle of that strange void, it appeared again. Boneca Laboo. Now it was moving, slowly rolling forward like a living tire, leaving behind a wet trail. Its human legs walked on nothing, and its eyeless gaze gleamed faintly through the fog. The creature tilted its head, and from its mouth came a quiet, drawn-out rasping sound. It was like a melody, the warped tune of an old music box, stretched beyond recognition. "I want to go home," whispered George. Peppa looked around. On the ground beside them stood the same music box that started it all. It trembled slightly, as if calling them. "Wind it up," said Peppa. George turned the handle. The melody played again, uneven, distorted. The creature twitched, stretched upward, and its outline began to fade into the mist. The world around them glowed with a pale, ghostly light. For a moment, it felt like they were returning. The air thickened, familiar. Through the mist, the shapes of boxes and shelves emerged once more. But when Peppa opened her eyes, they weren't home. The room looked almost the same, but colder, dimmer. Everything seemed drained of color. "Mummy? Daddy?" called Peppa. No answer, only the echo of her voice, repeating again and again, softer each time. On the floor sat the music box. It was closed. Peppa approached and touched it. From inside came the same whisper. Laboo. She slowly stepped back, holding George's hand. The whisper repeated. Now it came from behind them. They turned. In the shadow of the stairs stood Boneca Laboo, still, silent. Only its eyes reflected the faint light, as if waiting for the melody to start again. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night. At first, she thought it was just darker because of the rain, but soon she realized the darkness was different, too thick, too still. Even the air didn't move. She listened. No sound of George's breathing, no rain, no wind, only the dull thud of her own heartbeat. Peppa got out of bed. The room looked strange. The shapes of things seemed to blur, as if the light had forgotten how to touch them. George's bed was neatly made, the pillow smooth, untouched. "George?" she called softly. No answer. The house was silent. As she walked down the hallway, each step echoed faintly, as if the floor below was hollow. In every room, the beds were perfectly made. No toys, no wrinkles, no sign of life. In the kitchen, the plates were clean, the table shining, and there was no smell, no warmth, as if no one had ever lived there. "Mummy? Daddy?" Peppa's voice trembled. Only a dull echo came back from the dark. Peppa went to the window. There was no garden, no road, no streetlight. Only blackness, not night, but something else. It moved, flowed, alive. She opened the front door. Cold air hit her face, but it had no scent, no earth, no rain. Before her stretched an endless void. The town was gone. Puddles, hills, houses, everything replaced by a shimmering darkness that rippled like liquid smoke. She took a step forward. The ground beneath her vanished, yet she was still standing, as if the darkness itself held her up. She turned. The house was gone. Only her small shape hung in the void, surrounded by an endless breathing night. Then she saw it. At first, only movement, a faint ripple in the distance, then a shape. From the depths emerged a figure, small, elongated, its limbs thin, its eyes too dim, glowing lights. Laboo. He moved slowly, but the space between them seemed to shrink on its own. Each step sent a vibration through the air, as if the whole world tightened with him. "Where is my family?" Peppa whispered. Laboo stopped. His eyes were empty, no pupils, no life, yet something ancient flickered within them. From the depths of the blackness came a sound, not words, but a rhythm, like breathing, and the darkness seemed to whisper. They did not vanish, they became part of it. Peppa stepped back, but there was nothing behind her. The darkness touched her, slipping under her skin, seeping into her breath. The cold spread inside, not through her body, but deeper, where fear lives. For a moment, the house appeared again, ghostly, distorted. Walls made of mist, windows without light. In them stood 4 motionless figures with empty faces. They looked at Peppa, but did not recognize her. Then everything vanished again. Laboo stood beside her. His breathing was deep and steady. Each exhale extinguished the last traces of sound. Peppa felt her own voice dissolving, turning into a whisper, then fading into nothing. The world was collapsing quietly. No light, no cry. First, the horizon disappeared, then the air, then her own shadow. Laboo raised his paw and touched her shoulder. The space around them cracked like thin glass. From the fracture spilled a cold, silver light. It illuminated the two of them, Peppa and Laboo, and all else was gone. Now, they stood in nothingness. No up, no down, no time. Peppa didn't move. She didn't know if she was breathing or dreaming. Her reflection was gone. Only he remained. Laboo looked straight at her. In his eyes, she saw the town, dead, colorless, covered in ash. Where laughter once lived, only the wind wandered now. Peppa understood. He hadn't come. He had always been here. The darkness was him. The house, the town, everything. Only his breath. And now, with everything gone, he was no longer alone. In the endless night, where there is no beginning and no end, only two remained, Peppa and Laboo. And the world that once was became a whisper, fading forever into the black silence. That day, Peppa and her little sister Ivy were playing happily in their room. Peppa was building a tall tower with blocks, while Ivy, always a curious little one, was exploring every corner of the room. Suddenly, Ivy noticed something under Peppa's bed. She crawled over and pulled out a strange yellow toy with huge black eyes and sharp, realistic-looking teeth. The little one clapped her hands joyfully, hugging the find close to herself. Peppa was surprised. She had never seen this toy before. On the tag was written a strange name, Laboo. "Ivy, where did you get this toy?" "I've never seen it before," said Peppa, examining the strange creature. "What a weird name. And its teeth look so real." Despite the uneasy feeling, Peppa let Ivy play with the new toy. And then, something incredible happened. A second window appeared in the room, one that had never been there before. Behind this dark window stretched a gloomy forest with trees resembling the silhouettes of Laboo toys. "What is this? Where did this window come from?" exclaimed Peppa in shock. But Ivy seemed completely oblivious to the new window. She was entirely absorbed in playing with Laboo. Little Ivy pressed the toy to her ear, as if listening to something very important. She smiled and nodded her head, as if agreeing with something. "Ivy, who are you talking to?" asked the worried Peppa, but the little one just continued hugging the toy and smiling. When their mother entered the room, Peppa tried to tell her about the strange window and toy. "Mummy, look! A second window appeared in our room, and Ivy is talking to this strange toy," Peppa said excitedly, but their mother couldn't see anything. For her, there was only an ordinary wall, and Ivy was simply playing by herself. "You have quite an imagination, Peppa," said their mother, and left, unaware of the approaching danger. "But Mummy, it's right here!" cried Peppa, but it was useless. As night fell, events took an even more sinister turn. Peppa couldn't sleep, watching the dark window. Meanwhile, Ivy, hugging Laboo, began humming a strange, mesmerizing melody. The little one couldn't speak yet, but she hummed this tune as if she had known it her whole life. "Laboo, Laboo." "Ivy, what are you singing? How do you know this song?" asked Peppa fearfully, but Ivy just continued humming and rocking with the toy. Peppa looked at the second window and was horrified. Behind the glass, dozens of pairs of eyes were glowing. An entire army of Laboo toys was watching them from the dark forest. The next night, the most terrible thing happened. Peppa woke up to an unusual silence. Ivy's crib was empty. The Laboo toy had also disappeared. The second window was wide open, and in the forest, Peppa saw the retreating silhouette of her little sister. Ivy was walking, holding hands with a large figure that looked like Laboo. "Ivy, come back!" screamed Peppa, but it was too late. Ivy disappeared into the depths of the dark forest, and the window behind her closed and dissolved into the wall as if it had never existed. In the morning, their parents searched the entire house, the entire neighborhood, but Ivy was nowhere to be found. Mummy cried, Daddy called the police, and Peppa remained silent. She knew the truth, but who would believe her? A whole year passed. Peppa learned to live with this terrible secret. She played alone in her room, which now seemed too big and empty without Ivy's laughter. And then one day, while cleaning under her bed, Peppa found a small teddy bear. It was so cute and harmless. "What a lovely bear," smiled Peppa, picking it up. But as soon as she lifted the teddy bear, that same dark window appeared in the room again. Behind the glass stood Ivy. But this was no longer the cheerful little one that Peppa remembered. Ivy's skin had turned yellow, and her eyes were black, just like Laboo's. In her hands, she held that same cursed toy and slowly waved her hand. Although Ivy couldn't speak, Peppa seemed to hear her voice in her head. "Join us, big sister." Peppa dropped the teddy bear in horror. She realized that the nightmare was just beginning, and now Laboo had come for her. Peppa-Pig, the box of drawings. It started on a quiet morning. Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was dragging something along the floor. In the hallway, she saw him carrying a cardboard box. Old, dusty, no writing on it. It looked like something forgotten in a basement. "Where did you get that?" Peppa asked. George didn't answer. He just smiled. He placed the box on the floor and opened it. Inside were drawings, dozens. some on torn scraps of paper, others fresh and colourful, all drawn by a child's hoof. Did you draw these? George stayed silent. The first drawing was simple. Peppa standing in the kitchen, a broken cup on the floor, Daddy with a broom, Mummy holding a rag. A few hours later, it happened, exactly like in the drawing, down to the smallest detail. Peppa dropped a cup, shards scattered. Daddy sighed. Mummy got the rag. Just a coincidence, Mummy said. But George pulled out the next drawing. It showed their garden, a ball stuck in the tree, Daddy holding a ladder, Peppa reaching up. The next day the ball really did get stuck, in the same place, exactly like the drawing. Peppa started going through the drawings. The further she went, the darker they became. The colours, duller, the figures, twisted. One showed Peppa's room at night. At the window, a silhouette. Faceless. Peppa shoved it to the bottom of the box. But that night she woke up, went to the window. For a moment, she thought someone had just stepped out of view. Another drawing, the bathroom, the mirror, Peppa's reflection smiling, even though she wasn't. Another one, George sleeping, and beside his bed stood a second George, identical, but with red crayon eyes. Peppa hid the box in the closet, but George found it again. He said, "I have to keep watching." Every day, new drawings appeared, even though no one was drawing. One morning, at the very top of the pile, was a picture of that exact breakfast. The tablecloth, the cup, the toast, all correct. At the edge, a drop. Peppa thought it was paint, but it was tea. Then came a drawing of the living room. Daddy asleep in his chair, and behind him, someone reaching toward his shoulder. That evening, Daddy flinched. He said, "I thought someone touched me." But the room was empty. At last, Peppa found the final drawing. It was black and white. It showed herself, standing alone in an empty room. No windows, no toys. Her face, blank, arms limp at her sides, and behind her, the box, and written in neat handwriting, "Now you're inside." That night, Peppa woke up. The room felt unusually dark, too quiet. On the floor, the box, empty. All the drawings were gone. Only one remained. It lay on top. It showed Mummy, Daddy and George sitting at the table, smiling, laughing. But Peppa wasn't there, and at the bottom, written carefully, "They don't remember you anymore." Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window, a second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky. Mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees, watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, rain had been falling all evening. Drops tapped softly against the glass, and Peppa Pig's house was wrapped in a grey twilight. Peppa and George sat on the floor, stacking colourful blocks into a tower. Everything seemed ordinary, until the front door slammed shut. "Daddy? Mummy?" Peppa called. No answer. Only the sound of wet footsteps echoed through the hallway. Peppa stood up and peeked into the living room. Her parents were standing by the door. At first glance, they looked the same, but something was wrong. Mummy Pig was smiling, yet the smile was frozen, like it had been painted on. Her eyes were dark, without reflection. Daddy Pig moved too smoothly, as if his body slid rather than walked. A chill ran down Peppa's back. "You got wet?" she asked quietly. Daddy Pig tilted his head. Too far, then farther, and farther still, until it turned completely around. Peppa stepped back, clutching George. Mummy Pig took a step forward, her body bending unnaturally, as if her bones had turned soft. "Mummy?" George whispered. The answer was a low rasp, almost laughter, but without joy. Peppa grabbed George's hoof and ran upstairs. The boards creaked beneath them, as though the house itself tried to hold them back. The bedroom door slammed shut, and Peppa turned the key. Downstairs, silence returned. Only the rain outside and their quick, frightened breathing. Then came the first sound, a long, scraping noise, like claws on wood. Something was dragging a paw along the door. Then a whisper. At first, faint and muffled, then closer, until it sounded as if voices were speaking right through the keyhole. The shadows on the walls began to move. They pulsed and shifted, changing shape as if alive. One stretched to the ceiling and started crawling toward the bed. Peppa pressed George against herself, eyes fixed on the door. The scratching grew louder. The wood groaned under the weight of unseen claws, and suddenly the darkness burst into two blazing eyes. Fiery yellow, unblinking, they pierced the room like light through smoke. From the blackness emerged a massive owl. Its wings were spread wide, its talons long and sharp, its gaze cold and intelligent. It tilted its head, and its hoot sounded like a deep, mocking laugh. The windows rattled from the sound. Peppa shielded George, feeling the owl's shadow stretch across the walls. The creature moved closer to the door, slowly, deliberately. Every touch of its talon left a mark, deep scratches that seemed to melt the wood. The owl leaned toward the keyhole. In the silence came the sound of breathing, heavy and rasping. "Pay, pay," a voice whispered. She couldn't tell whether it was the owl speaking or something else entirely. The door trembled, first gently, then stronger. It seemed ready to crack. The shadows on the walls gathered together, pulling toward a single point. The whole room shivered, and then it stopped. Total silence. Only the rain remained. Peppa didn't move for a long time. Finally, she crept to the door and pressed her ear to it. Nothing. She exhaled slowly and turned to George. He sat motionless, staring into the corner of the room. Peppa followed his gaze and saw it. On the floor, beneath the window, in a small puddle of rainwater, was a single claw print. Outside, the forest loomed dark. Something moved among the trees. Peppa squinted and saw a shape, tall, with vast wings spread wide. It stood silently on a branch, watching. The owl had not left.